So I'm Ryan Wheeler. I'm the invasive species biologist for the DNR Wildlife Division and for the Forest Resource Division. And a large part of my job is focused on supporting SISMAs and other invasive species partnerships through, different funding sources like the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program and the Good Neighbor Authority partnership with the Forest Service and in all the outcomes of that work, the topic of engagement stands out as it's both like a critical component of the successes I see, but it's also a gap in our work that I think we could grow into with just a little bit of effort. So my hope is that by the end of this presentation, you'll have learned a bit about engagement and have at least two practical things that you can take away and implement in your work relatively easily. And if I do it without putting my foot in my mouth, that'd be a nice bonus. But we'll see. But before I get into this, I want to recognize just a wonderful team that I've had the pleasure to work with over the past 2 years on this stuff. This is the DNR Wildlife Division's Stakeholder Engagement Work Group. And before COVID, this group was tasked with helping the Wildlife Division understand and increase its capacity to do effective engagement. So the content I'm going to present here comes from that work and their expertise, and I've tried to adapt it with invasive species examples and for this audience. So I think you might recognize some of these folks, like Jen Kleitsch there. She's part of the Cake SISMA, I know. James Miller's been part of some of the hemlock woolly adelgid stuff on game areas in the past. I know Barb Avers, she's been involved in mute swan work. And of course, Alexa Warwick, she's helping us out. She's facilitating the coordinator conversation this afternoon. And so there might be others on there that you recognize, but good group. So by the end of this talk, I'm hoping you'll be able to understand the difference between engagement and outreach. I want you to understand why engagement is important. You should also come away with some actionable strategies you can implement, specifically thinking about your work along a spectrum of participation and perhaps where it could shift to get better outcomes. And then I want you to be able to do a basic stakeholder analysis of your stakeholders, which that should also help you determine how to approach your engagement. If for SISMA coordinators specifically, I'd encourage you to think about these tools in the context of your strategic plan updates. And so hopefully this pairs well with Christina's talk. But I think there's also concepts in here that'll benefit non-SISMA folks too. And I've tried to pull in a couple examples for that. All right, so let's start off, talking about these terms. On one side, we have outreach, which we do a lot. And in outreach, we are reaching out, communicating out. We have knowledge and skills that are right, because science, and we send it out. We also have a lot of great strategies to persuade people and get them interested in accepting our knowledge. That persuasion is, kind of like marketing. But for simplicity's sake, that's also on the left side of this graphic with outreach. Engagement on the other side that's two-way communication. We bring science, knowledge, skills, but that's got to get blended with the values and interests and experiences of stakeholders in order to make decisions on what we're going to do. So this is maybe a little more details in those bullets there. You can kind of see the comparison. Working for the public versus working with the public, the directional flow of knowledge and things like that. But so who's a stakeholder? I just mentioned stakeholder there. And a stakeholder is anybody who affects or is affected by invasive species or invasive species management, at least in the context of this talk. That's pretty broad. So you'll hear me say stakeholders, but in some specific examples, I might use partners or the public, and just know that I'm fitting those into, like, these are partners who are affected or affected by invasive species issues. And so I'm just fitting into that more general term of stakeholders. Okay, so engagement's a process where stakeholders get to be part of decisions. In some cases, you might think that's great, and I wish more people cared and would get involved in my decisions. And in other cases, maybe that's scary to give up some power to some folks you might not agree with. But more on that a little bit later. It's a process where you want to think about how people can be affected by your decisions and how people can influence the implementation of those decisions. If we want to respond to stiltgrass, for example, we might want to be engaging with both landowners who have their, they got to give their permission to manage on their property, but also the neighbors who don't have it, and maybe natural areas 30 miles down the road, and potential funding sources and regulatory agencies. They're all part of affecting or being affected by that issue. But we'll get into that a little more later too with our stakeholder analysis. And as you'll see, engagement occurs on a spectrum with greater impact on decisions at one end and lesser on the other end. So just generally speaking, by now, I'm hoping you have a little bit of a sense between, the difference between outreach and engagement. And if you're ever confused, just ask yourself if there's any meaningful impact on a decision happening, and that might be an indicator for you to figure out whether or not you're engaging with people or just doing outreach. Okay, so the next topic I want to hit is why engagement is important. And for this, I want to start off by highlighting the composition of the SYSMA network, right? So the data represented here is from your core funding application, so the SYSMA's core funding applications that were just submitted back in October. You can see SYSMA's in Michigan have 642 partner organizations, and included in that number, you can't see it on here, but 159 of those are steering committee member organizations. So that's a bit less than 25% that are meeting regularly to discuss the business of the SYSMA. And, the rest, I assume, range from just getting an email update to maybe even implementing on the ground work for the SYSMA. And I really want to hit this point with a strong statement, and that is that the people and organizations represented by this chart are the most important part of a SYSMA. Coordinators are part of that too. You guys you're in that chart, right? But more than the acres you treat, more than the outreach impressions, more than the absolutely impressive amount of additional funding that you all secure, which by the way was 1.7 million just in fiscal year 21. I mean, you all way more than doubled your core funding with outside funding sources, but I'm still saying that the number of people that are meaningfully engaged in invasive species management decisions is most important. This is that part for where I'm hoping I'm not putting my foot in my mouth. Those interactions are more important because they're a critical component of collective action, right? And then having socially supported outcomes. You think about how some of this stuff has been approached in the past. Any agency could give funding to an interested organization to do invasive species work, or just put out a bid and hire a contractor. But there's a massive difference in outcomes between an organization or contractor creating their own success versus the organization that creates success that is shared by a broad network with relevant ties to the issue. So I want to just to really drive this one home, if I haven't beaten it enough, is an excerpt from the CWMA cookbook about steering committees, and I think that kind of hits on this theme. And the quote is, who leads the CWMA should not be as important as the overall steering committee activity. The goal is to move leadership by one person or organization to leadership by the entire steering committee. They're talking about collective action there, and the way to do that is through effective engagement around decisions. At least that's what I'm saying for my presentation here. All right, so good engagement builds trust. It makes the collaboration relevant. It creates ownership of the issues, inspires collective action. It can also help you weed through unnecessary conflict. But in order for it all to work, you need to make clear promises and be able to follow through. And I'll talk a little more on promises in a little bit, but for now, that is why engagement is important, and I hopefully that's a clear message. All right, so I mentioned that engagement occurs along a spectrum, and so this is the graphic I used for outreach versus engagement, and we can add a little detail to that with this spectrum. This spectrum graphic was created by the International Association for Public Participation, and I hear it mostly referred to as the IAP2 spectrum of participation, or the IAP2 spectrum, whatever. Might be other variations. So the International Association of Public Participation developed this thing, and they developed it to help clarify the role of the public in project planning and decision-making stuff. So it's a pretty good resource. You could even look at it like a menu to start thinking about, you know, a game plan for how you might do your engagement. This spectrum and like clarifying the role of the public, you could also say like clarifying the role of partners or stakeholders, whatever. It works in a lot of different ways. So misalignment, like where your partners or stakeholders' expectations of participation is one thing, and then what you communicate or what you actually implement is different. That's like a main source of conflict that I see, at least in my work. Most frequently, I see it in SISMA steering committees, but you could probably see it in other places as well. So when commitments are understood and kept, and the process is meaningful, right? So it's not just that you make a promise and follow through. It's that the involvement of that person fits somewhere along this spectrum in a way that's meaningful to them. And if you do that, then trust is built. The same dynamic can be applied at all different scales, like between fiduciaries and steering committees, even between government agencies and SISMAs. You could even apply it like employees, but the engagement between employees and supervisors and staff, you know. So that's the kind of the key statement there is when commitments are understood and kept and the process is meaningful, then trust is built. One caveat I would add is that a promise of participation, that only works for people that participate. So people who don't participate is often, you know, just as important as who does. But we'll talk about who's is and not at the table later on. So I'm going to go through these just one by one real quick. Inform, this is your one-way engagement. You might even say this is outreach, right? So this is us communicating to stakeholders with, you know, objective information to help them understand things. And we're saying we'll keep you informed, and we're not asking for any feedback. This, you know, this is a lot of the stuff that we all do with like updates, web pages, written reports, things like that. An example of this with steering committees are like active grant status updates and accomplishment reports. I see a bunch of coordinators do that, and that's a pretty cool thing. At this point, folks might be thinking, well, hey, didn't you say we do too much outreach? Or think, you know, if you say too much, if you do too much work in the inform category there, that's a bad thing. But it's not necessarily, it's not good or bad, it's just different. It's not always better to be on one side or the other. We're trying to get it right and to have it be meaningful for the individual. Okay, so Consult, that's somewhat limited two-way engagement. Like you ask questions and your stakeholders respond. The goal here is to get their input on an issue, and your proposed solutions and maybe even the outcomes you're working towards. When you consult, it's the same as inform, but you've promised to listen essentially and let them know how they influence the decision. There's a couple of examples of how you would implement that there. A facilitator might be used in some cases here. I think in most cases you can do it without one, but I think a lot of strategic plan update engagement with the general public could happen here, or maybe inactive partners. I've heard them described. Okay, so involved, this could be two-way or multi-way engagement. There's learning happening on all sides, even stakeholders learning from stakeholders. So, but the primary organization is the decision maker in the end, and that could be the steering committee or the fiduciary, I think in a SISMA case. The goal here is to work directly with the stakeholders through the whole process, and make sure that their issues and concerns are consistently understood. Collaborate, this one's a two-way or multi-way engagement. There's joint decision-making and action happening. So the goal here is to partner with your stakeholders through the whole process, including developing the solutions and alternatives. I think this is probably a good level, at least in the SISMA steering committee example, or excuse me, SISMA strategic plan example. This is probably a good level for steering committees, at least. And most fiduciaries should probably be trying to interact with the rest of their steering committee at this level for most things, right? So I just shifted context there, right? So there's the steering committee working on a strategic plan. You guys should probably be collaborating on that. But then if you shift your seat to, okay, now you're the fiduciary, you should be trying to collaborate with your steering committee, right? Joint decision making. Last one here is empower. For empower, the decisions are completely delegated to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders have to play an active role in the governance, and that's the goal too. So this would be if you wanted to place the final decision in the hands of the stakeholders. So there's few, if any, examples of this that I could think of, but that's all right. And as you're thinking about your goal, just know some folks might expect this level, like they want to be empowered, and you should know why you can or can't offer that, right? So an example might be in the SISMA case, right? If a steering committee wants to be completely empowered to make a hiring decision on behalf of a fiduciary, that might not be possible due to HR laws or whatever, but you could still collaborate. So that could be something to be upfront about. Make sure that you communicate if you know some folks might be expecting that, right? And again, another important thing to note with all these things is that being to the right or left doesn't mean better or lesser. Remember, we're trying to go for clarity and then alignment of expectations, right? So that is the IAP2 spectrum of participation, and I encourage you to pull this thing out when you're thinking about your work. Hope you guys can't hear my dog barking over there, but apologize for that. So the last part I want to cover is stakeholder analysis, and the simple way to put this is, who am I supposed to engage with? Not all stakeholders are the same, and what's meaningful for one group might not be meaningful to another. So some may interact with different stakeholders at different points along that spectrum, and you'll need to prioritize. So this chart is called the interest influence matrix. And recall earlier that stakeholders are those who affect or can be affected by invasive species or invasive species management. So you can think of those who affect invasive species issues as having influence, right? On the left side there. That could be both, they have influence because they have resources or they have authority over maybe property or laws or something like that, or even vectors, right? If you're a vector, you have an influence on an invasive species issue. And then you can think of those who can be affected by invasive species issues as having interest, right? So that includes both harm and benefits. And you can see that that group of individuals that fall in the upper right corner, that's where you should be focusing to make sure you get it right. You want to make sure you got enough energy. That's first priority. Below that, you need to focus on the specific issues or interests in that bottom right. And then in the upper left there, you want to make sure that you monitor and manage, because they've got a lot of high influence on your issue, but they might not be as focused on it. They might have other things they're worried about. And in the bottom left there, you don't want to neglect those folks, but you could probably spend a little less energy there. They're at least not the top priority, right? So, okay, let's try an example. Here's an example of how you could do this for a SISMA strategic plan. And this is subjective, so this could be different for you. It could also, have a different resolution, right? So you could actually drill into just your steering committee and think about where each steering committee might fit on this chart. And so this is an exercise that you would do on your own or with your team to help you plan something like that. So apologies again for my dog. Maybe you guys can't even hear, but it's annoying me. All right, so let's take this and think about how we could apply the spectrum of participation to it, right? So in this overlay, I've overlaid the spectrum categories that I want to use for these groups, right? And this is just something I chose, right? And this is just one way you can think about this stuff. It's maybe a useful exercise to recognize, hey, maybe we just need to do a public comment period for the general public for our strategic plan, or maybe other partners need to have more participation or be more involved. You can use this chart to also ask who's not here that should be. Remember before I mentioned that who's not participating is really important. So ask yourself who's not here, and look where the gaps are. We could say, okay, there's potential new partners in these areas where we don't have anybody. All right, so let's try one more example, because remember, this can be applied to just about any collaboration you're leading, even employee-employee relationships. So this is a little different example. I just made this up. It's a Canadian 97 km/h weed, and you can kind of see I just threw all of the groups that I thought might be relevant to that issue. And so it's a close cousin to a different, dog strangling vine. So I figured, yes, you can see hunters that use dogs up there. They might have a high interest because of their dog, but maybe they have less of an interest. But if we keep going with this example, it's kind of the same thing. But you can kind of think about where would you place each of these groups. What promise of participation would be meaningful for them in that work. Okay, so in drilling down from a SISMA standpoint, you can get more specific with this stuff. And for SISMAs to think about, this is the rest of that data, right? At the beginning, I showed that big chart that showed all of the SISMA partners, or the composition of SISMA partners. And if you drill into the non-governmental organizational partners, that's the biggest group there. There's a whole bunch of different people that aren't, and groups that aren't necessarily represented in every SISMA, but they're represented in some. So some of these categories might be ideas of people who aren't participating that could be in decisions. I'll give the same thing with local partners. Obviously, conservation districts play a pretty big role in a lot of SISMAs, but we've got some other ones too in local partners with counties, cities, and townships. Okay, so my hope is that now you understand the difference between engagement and outreach, and why engagement is important, and I hope you can use that spectrum to think about how you engage and what that means, what promise you're making to the people you're engaging with, and to also be able to conduct your own stakeholder analysis. Think about who's involved in the work you do, and who should be. And I could keep going, but I am going to mute because I might think my dog's going to lose it here. But I'm going to end there and see if there's questions.
Yeah, so if you've got questions for Ryan, again, we can do the chat. I know some people are still having some issues with the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand. Looks like we've got a hand raised. Sigrid. Go ahead, Sigrid.
So Ryan, you gave a statement that I wanted to ponder longer, and then I couldn't get it all down in order to ponder it. So I'm going to give you the start of it and hope that you can finish it. This is your quiz.
Yeah.
When commitments are understood and kept, and then I think the next was the promises are maybe followed, and the promises are followed through on, and then something, and then engagement, or I just missed it because I was thinking while I was writing and I couldn't get it fast enough.
Yeah, good question. So it's two things. It's, there's trust in, making promises and following through on them. But part of that promise is that the engagement in the decision for the stakeholder needs to be meaningful. And the example I've run into for this is, you may have a steering committee. I'm just going to use this. Apologize. I had a package dropped off, and my dog wants to kill the mailman. So a steering committee member may want to have a stronger influence in decisions than what they're being given. So that's not meaningful. Like, if they can't show up and say, this is the priority species or issue that I care about, and actually have that be be reflected in the decision that gets made, it's not meaningful for that person. So I'll just stop there so you guys don't have to listen to my dog barking.
Did that do it for you, Sigrid?
Well, I was hoping for an exact replica of what he said, because it was said in a way that it hit something in my head that wanted to think longer, but it's gone. So I'm sorry.
Well, we are recording this, so at a later
point.
time, later date, we can go back and you could hit that recording and check it out and get it that way.
Yeah, it's actually, that's a direct quote out of the IAP2 stuff, and I can actually pull it up here. Hang on.
I'm wondering if there is any way, if a coordinator such as myself so wanted, to have sort of a consult with you, Ryan, or whoever, to go through our specific issues and come out with resolutions that we can try, potential resolutions that we can try to these issues, sort of an iterative approach to increasing our engagement, because I struggle with that, and I guess I feel like if I don't get some external help with it, it's not going to change much, or it's going to change so in such a small way that by the time I die, there's hardly going to be a noticeable interest in engagement.
Yeah, absolutely, Sigrid. I've actually been trying to do some of this stuff with a few of the new coordinators, and I'd maybe call on Audrey and Keely to tell, or any of the others, to tell me whether or not that helped. But I'm absolutely interested in working on this stuff, and if I can't come up with a solution, I know quite a few people smarter than me that that we can pull in resources to help us.